The date was late October, 1944. Deep within the mist-choked woods of Belgium, not far from the German frontier, battle-hardened Wehrmacht troops crouched in foxholes dug into the damp earth. The air smelled of pine, smoke, and rain. These men were no strangers to war. They had marched through half a continent, across the endless frozen plains of Russia, through the burning dunes of North Africa, and back again into the ruins of Europe. They were soldiers carved by hardship, molded by exhaustion, and sharpened by survival. Now they waited again, rifles across their knees, listening for the enemy's approach. They had fought the British with discipline, endured the fury of Soviet offensives, and traded blows with the Americans before. Yet something about this time felt different. Word from headquarters had filtered down through the ranks. Rumors of a new American division massing across the line. The 104th Infantry Division, they called themselves. The Timberwolves. Supposedly fresh from the United States, green as spring grass. The German officers smirked at the thought. Farm boys and factory hands, no doubt. Men who had never stared into the eyes of death or heard the whistle of incoming artillery. It would be, they assumed, another easy test of their steel. What they did not know, what they could not yet imagine, was that the Timberwolves were led by a man whose name would soon haunt their dreams. A commander whose reputation for audacity and unrelenting aggression would spread like wildfire through the German ranks. His men called him Terrible Terry. His enemies called him a nightmare. His real name was Terry de la Mesa Allen. Terry de la Mesa Allen was born on April 1, 1888, at Fort Douglas, in the rugged Utah Territory. His arrival seemed almost preordained. Soldiering ran through his veins like blood through his heart. His father, Colonel Samuel Allen, was a professional officer who had spent his life patrolling the far edges of the American frontier. His mother came from a line no less martial. Her father, Captain Carlos Alvarez de la Mesa, had fought at Gettysburg in the 39th New York Volunteer Infantry, a proud regiment known as the Garibaldi Guard. Captain de la Mesa had stood among the swirling chaos of that terrible battle in July 1863, where the wheat fields turned red with the lifeblood of thousands. Wounded in the fight but refusing to yield, he carried the Union banner through to victory. His courage became family legend, whispered across generations. To be an Allen or a de la Mesa was to serve, to endure, and to lead. So, when young Terry was born on an army post, surrounded by bugles and barracks, it was as if destiny had already chosen his path. Growing up on scattered posts across the American West, Terry Allen learned early that comfort was a luxury soldiers rarely enjoyed. He rode horses before he could spell his own name, shot rifles before he could write. The rhythm of military life, reveille at dawn, drills under a blazing sun, endless packing and moving, became as natural to him as breathing. In 1907, his family's pride swelled when Terry received an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. It was every military father's dream. But for Terry, it was a nightmare. The rigid structure of West Point grated against his nature. He was impatient, impulsive, and defiant. Endless mathematics bored him to tears. The constant inspections and demerits felt like chains. His instructors found him unruly, and his classmates nicknamed him Tear Around Allen because he could never sit still. He failed courses, stumbled through oral exams, and racked up disciplinary reports. By 1911, his fate was sealed. He failed both ordnance and gunnery and was dismissed from the academy. For most young men, that would have been the end of a military career. But Terry Allen was not most men. Allen refused to quit. He enrolled at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., completing his degree the hard way, through grit and persistence. In 1912, against all odds, he earned a commission in the U.S. Cavalry. It was a moment that defined him. He had not entered the army through the academy's gilded gates, but through sheer stubborn will. That stubbornness would shape everything that followed. Serving on the Mexican border in 1913, Allen quickly earned a reputation for reckless courage. When a band of 30 armed rustlers crossed into U.S. territory, Allen, with only 6 troopers, charged in pursuit rather than wait for reinforcements. Military protocol would have condemned such rashness, but the result was undeniable. The raiders were captured or killed. Allen's superiors frowned, but his men admired him. He was bold, unorthodox, and utterly fearless. When America entered World War I, Allen longed for action. He feared the war would end before he could test himself in real combat. His first assignment, however, was far from glorious, hauling ammunition to the front lines in France. Yet even from the driver's seat of a supply convoy, he watched, learned, and planned. His chance came at last when he was given command of a battalion in the 358th Infantry, 90th Division. In the bloody fields of Saint-Mihiel and later in the Meuse-Argonne, Allen found his element. The Western Front was a graveyard of old tactics. Daylight assaults led to catastrophic losses, with machine guns and artillery shredding attackers before they could cross no man's land. But Allen saw opportunity where others saw only death. He began experimenting with night attacks, operations that most officers avoided because of confusion and risk. To Allen, darkness was an ally. At night, the defenders' advantages vanished. Their guns could not find clear targets. Their observers saw nothing. Fear spread faster than gunfire. He crafted new methods: thorough reconnaissance by day, simple plans that could be executed by memory, silent movements, whistle signals instead of radios. Every man was to know his task without hesitation. His men learned to trust him and to fear him a little. He demanded perfection because mistakes under darkness meant death. On the night of October 24, 1918, during one of these daring operations, Allen was struck in the face by enemy machine gun fire. Bloodied but alive, he refused evacuation, insisting he remain with his men until the battle was won. That defiance, that raw courage, earned him the Silver Star and 2 Purple Hearts. By war's end, he had become what the Army needed most: an officer who led from the front. Peace came, and with it, a different kind of struggle. The post-war Army shrank almost overnight. Once proud combat leaders found themselves reduced to paper pushers, their promotions frozen for years. Ambitious officers resigned or faded into obscurity. Allen did neither. He endured. In 1920, he competed in a grueling 300-mile horseback endurance race across Texas, a brutal test that harkened back to the frontier days. He completed the course in just over 101 hours, outlasting veteran cowboys and cavalrymen alike. That same year, he earned a bronze medal in polo at the Antwerp Olympics as part of the U.S. Army team, showcasing both his skill and his indomitable spirit. But even as Allen clung to the traditions of the old cavalry, he sensed that the age of horses was ending. The world was changing, machines replacing mounts, engines replacing muscle. He watched closely, studying the lessons of modern war. He pored over reports from the Great War, dissecting every failure and innovation. He saw that victory in the next conflict would depend not on gallant charges, but on mobility, coordination, and firepower. Tanks, radios, aircraft, these would shape the future battlefield. And so he adapted. While others clung to the romance of cavalry, Allen focused on preparation. Wherever he was posted, he trained his men relentlessly. He emphasized realism in drills, mud, exhaustion, confusion, and all. Soldiers who served under him said his exercises were tougher than actual combat. That was precisely the point. He knew another war was coming. The question was not if, but when. By the time the world plunged back into chaos in 1939, Allen had spent 2 decades forging his craft in obscurity. When the United States joined the fight, he finally received command of the 1st Infantry Division. the legendary Big Red One. There, his unorthodox methods would make him both revered and reviled. But that part of his story, the rise, the disgrace, the return to glory, would come later. For now, in the damp forests of Belgium, those German soldiers who huddled in their trenches had no idea that the commander leading the Timberwolves across the line was not a conventional general. He was a brawler in uniform, a man who had failed, bled, and clawed his way back again and again. And soon they would learn firsthand what Terrible Terry meant. Because Terry Allen didn't just fight wars, he lived them. And when he came for you, he didn't bring hesitation, he brought hell. While other officers marked the years until retirement, content to shuffle papers and wait out their time, Terry Allen did not sit still. He drilled, studied, and trained, shaping himself and anyone who would listen for the war he knew was inevitable. The 1930s had been an uneasy decade, and Allen could see the storm clouds gathering across the Atlantic and the Pacific. While some dismissed his obsession with preparation as paranoia, he understood that peace never lasted long. Then, on the first day of October 1940, the course of his life shifted forever. The United States Army, still small and unprepared for global conflict, was being rebuilt under the sharp eye of its new Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall. Marshall was a man of rare vision, calm, disciplined, and possessed of an uncanny ability to spot true leadership in unlikely places. Among the piles of personnel files crossing his desk, one name caught his attention: Lieutenant Colonel Terry de la Mesa Allen. Where others saw a troublesome officer, brilliant but too rough, too undisciplined, Marshall saw a fighter, a commander who could lead men in the chaos of real battle. Against the advice of more traditional subordinates, Marshall did something unheard of. He promoted Allen directly from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, skipping the rank of full colonel entirely. It was an extraordinary leap, a signal that the Army's new leadership valued combat instincts over etiquette. Marshall knew that in the coming war, soldiers would follow men who led from the front, not from behind a desk. In May 1942, the opportunity to prove himself arrived. Allen was given command of the 1st Infantry Division, known across the Army and the world as the Big Red One. It was the oldest and most storied division in American service, its shield marked with a single red numeral, its traditions running back to World War I. Marshall had called Allen outstanding, a leader who can do anything with men and officers. Now, it was time to see if that faith was justified. On November 8, 1942, the Big Red One stormed ashore at Oran, Algeria, as part of Operation Torch, the first American offensive in the European theater. Allen went ashore with his men, just as he always had. Bullets hissed through the surf. Artillery shells tore into the beaches. The division suffered over 400 casualties that day, 94 killed, scores wounded, 75 missing. But by nightfall, the beaches were secure. America was in the fight. The months that followed tested every lesson Allen had ever learned. North Africa was a brutal proving ground. The Germans under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel were masters of desert warfare, hardened by years of victories. The Americans were untested, their green troops meeting veterans who had perfected the art of mechanized battle. In February 1943, Rommel struck with devastating precision at Kasserine Pass. The attack was a nightmare. American lines crumbled, units fell into confusion, equipment was abandoned, and tanks rolled through gaps like water through a breached dam. For the first time, the United States Army tasted full defeat. But where others saw collapse, Allen saw a challenge. Rallying his division, he and General Paul Robinette counterattacked at Jebel Hamra on February 21st. Allen personally directed artillery fire and repositioned his infantry under fire, shouting orders from an exposed ridge. By nightfall, the enemy advance had been blunted. 400 prisoners were captured, the line stabilized, and the disaster contained. It was a turning point. The Americans had learned, painfully, that courage was not enough. They needed leadership that could turn chaos into control. Allen provided exactly that. The next great test came at El Gueter in March 1943. Rommel's Africa Corps attacked with tanks and motorized infantry, determined to crush the Americans before they could recover. For 21 days, Allen's division held under constant pressure. The fighting was fierce and unrelenting. The desert sun turned the battlefield into a furnace. Water was scarce, dust and smoke filled the air. The Germans probed, flanked, and charged again and again, but each time they were met with disciplined fire from Allen's infantry and anti-tank guns. On March 23rd, German armor broke through the forward lines and came dangerously close to the division headquarters. Staff officers, seeing tanks approaching through the haze, urged Allen to withdraw to safer ground. He refused. Pulling back would mean panic. It would signal weakness. His answer was pure Allen, raw, blunt, and unforgettable. "I'll be damned if I pull out, and I'll shoot the first man who does." He walked calmly out of the command tent and stood in the open, binoculars in hand, as shells landed nearby. His composure rippled through the men around him. If the general wasn't running, nobody would. The forward units held. Artillery and tank destroyers zeroed in on the enemy, turning the battlefield into a graveyard of burning armor. The German assault failed. El Gueter was more than a tactical victory. It was symbolic. It marked the first time American forces had decisively defeated veteran German armored troops in open battle. Rommel's legend met its match in a fiery, defiant Texan who refused to back down. 2 months later, in May 1943, the Big Red One spearheaded the final drive on Tunis. By the time the guns fell silent on May 9th, Axis resistance in North Africa had collapsed. 4 days later, 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered. The campaign was over. The price had been steep. The 1st Division lost 2,000 men in the final weeks alone. But victory belonged to them. Allen's division had proved what the new American army could do. But there would be no rest. The next target was Sicily on July 10, 1943. Under Operation Husky, the Big Red One landed on the beaches near Gela. The area was a natural fortress, hills overlooking the sea, German and Italian guns already zeroed in, armor waiting just beyond the horizon. General George S. Patton personally chose Allen's division for the toughest sector, knowing only the best could handle it. The initial landings succeeded, but the following day brought crisis. German tanks from the elite Hermann Göring division counterattacked, rolling toward the beachhead. If they broke through, they would drive the Americans into the sea. Allen's troops, caught in open ground, fought desperately to hold. Offshore, U.S. Navy ships fired over the heads of their own men, blasting the approaching armor. The combined fury of naval guns, artillery, and infantry fire finally broke the attack. Omar Bradley, watching from the front, later wrote, "I doubt that any other division in the United States Army could have held that beach." The Big Red One had done it again, but Sicily was not finished with them. The campaign became a duel of pride between Patton's 7th Army and Montgomery's 8th, each racing to capture the island first. Allen's men were given the hardest ground, mountain passes and fortified towns. The fiercest of all was Troina, perched high in the Sicilian hills. From July 31st to August 6th, the 1st Division fought to seize the town. Every inch was contested. German artillery raked the slopes. Machine guns tore through advancing infantry. American soldiers climbed and clawed their way up rocky ridges under constant fire. The Germans counterattacked 24 times in 6 days. Each assault was met with ferocious resistance. Allen's artillery fired until the barrels glowed red. Infantry companies were reduced to half strength, yet still they advanced. When Troina finally fell on August 6th, the way to Messina lay open. But the cost was staggering. The men were exhausted, their uniforms stiff with sweat and dust, their ranks thinned by months of relentless combat. 3 days later, on August 9th, Time magazine hit the newsstands with Major General Terry Allen on the cover, a symbol of American grit and triumph. The article hailed him as a commander of rare energy and charisma, a man whose name carried the shine of victory. But even as the nation celebrated him, his command had already been taken away. 2 days earlier, on August 7th, Omar Bradley had relieved Allen of command of the 1st Infantry Division. Officially, the reason was discipline. Bradley believed Allen and his deputy, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., had allowed the division's battlefield success to breed arrogance and informality. The men of the Big Red One were fierce in combat, but sloppy off-duty. Bradley, ever the disciplinarian, decided a new hand was needed. Allen's replacement was Major General Clarence Hubner, a stern officer from the old school. Yet rumors swirled that the decision had been made even before Sicily began, that Eisenhower and Patton had planned to replace Allen once his job was done. He was the perfect commander to lead a Green Army through the fire, but perhaps too volatile for the politics of a long war. Eisenhower later said, "It would be a terrible injustice to suggest Allen was relieved for inefficiency." Bradley himself wrote, "No one surpassed the unpredictable Terry Allen in leading men, but neither he nor Roosevelt possessed the instincts of disciplinarians." The truth lay somewhere between admiration and unease. Allen cared more for victory than for parade ground polish. His soldiers loved him fiercely for it, but to the higher command, that love looked dangerously close to insubordination. So, at the height of his fame, his photograph on every magazine rack, his name spoken with respect and envy, Terry Allen was sent home. Most men would have taken that as an ending. Allen saw it as a pause. On October 15, 1943, he accepted a demotion back to Brigadier General and reported to Camp Adair, Oregon, to take command of a brand new formation, the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves. They were fresh recruits, clerks, farmhands, and students who had never seen battle. But Allen looked at them and saw possibility. He knew how to turn ordinary men into soldiers. He'd done it before. And in the forests of Belgium, a year later, the Germans would learn that Terry Allen was far from finished. He was only getting started. They came from small towns and open plains, from dusty farms and humming factories across the western states. The average Timberwolf was barely 20, young enough to still believe in invincibility, yet old enough to have already seen hardship. Most had never been far from home before boarding the troop trains to Oregon. They were raw, green soldiers in every sense of the word. The Germans, reading intelligence reports, dismissed them before they ever fired a shot. Another division of amateurs, they thought. Another group of Americans who would panic under fire. Terry Allen looked at those young faces and saw something else entirely. Beneath the inexperience, beneath the awkward salutes and uncertain eyes, he saw potential. But potential meant nothing without work. Hard, punishing, relentless work. Allen knew that training was not about repetition. It was about transformation. He would turn these boys into soldiers capable of moving, fighting, and surviving when most others would falter. From the first day, Allen made it clear that the 104th Infantry Division would not be ordinary. He announced his goal openly, to create the most thoroughly trained division in the United States Army. And he would do it his way, by teaching them to fight when the world went dark. Most divisions dreaded the night. Darkness was the enemy of control. Visibility vanished. Formations disintegrated. Confusion spread like wildfire. But Allen understood what fear could do to men. He wanted his soldiers to confront it, master it, and then use it as a weapon. While the Army required only 10 to 12 hours of tactical instruction a week, Allen drove his men through 30 to 35. Some weeks, they trained 6 hours a day beyond their normal duties. There were no shortcuts. Marches through the Oregon wilderness became nightly ordeals. Rain, mud, and exhaustion were constants. Sleep was a privilege, not a guarantee. Allen's obsession was night fighting. He broke down the mechanics of movement in darkness until it became instinct. Men learned to navigate by the feel of the land, the slope of the ground, the direction of the wind, the faint outline of trees against the stars. They used compasses and memorized terrain features until they could move through the forest blindfolded. He taught them to communicate without words. Every squad had hand signals, touch cues, and prearranged codes for movement. Radios were used sparingly. Allen knew the enemy could intercept transmissions. Instead, his men learned to coordinate attacks in silence, to advance without a sound, and to trust completely in the man beside them. At night, trust was everything. You couldn't see who was next to you, couldn't always tell where your commander was. You had to know. That kind of confidence only came through relentless repetition. So they practiced, first in small groups, then companies, then full battalion maneuvers. Live ammunition, real artillery, smoke, chaos. Allen wanted them to feel fear during training so that in combat, fear would feel familiar. Other divisions at Camp Adair laughed. They thought Allen had gone mad. His men were constantly exhausted, stumbling back to barracks at 3 a.m, mud-caked and half-blind with fatigue. But Allen ignored the ridicule. He wasn't training them for comfort. He was training them to survive. He understood a fundamental truth of warfare. Surprise was the ultimate advantage. Night attacks, when done right, were faster, quieter, deadlier, and they saved lives. Defenders who couldn't see their attackers couldn't shoot accurately. Artillery, the greatest killer on the battlefield, became nearly useless in total darkness. By the summer of 1944, the Timberwolves were ready. They were the first and only American division trained specifically for night operations. Omar Bradley himself would later admit, "Allen brought the only division I know of that was prepared for night combat." That preparation would soon pay dividends written in blood and victory. On October 23, 1944, the 104th Infantry Division entered combat near the German border in Belgium. Across the lines, German commanders waited eagerly. Intelligence had told them this new American division was green, unblooded, inexperienced, predictable. They prepared to teach the young Americans a lesson, but that first night, Terry Allen turned their confidence into terror. Under cover of darkness, his troops moved silently through the Belgian forests. No talking, no lights, only the faint click of equipment and the whisper of boots through wet leaves. They advanced by compass, by memory, by instinct. When they reached the enemy lines, they struck from directions the Germans hadn't even considered possible. Sentinels were taken silently, throats cut before alarms could sound. Positions were overrun before defenders knew what was happening. German machine gunners fired wildly into the black, wasting ammunition on ghosts. By the time dawn came, the lines were shattered. Entire platoons had been wiped out in their sleep. Those who survived spoke of shadows moving through the trees. Americans who came without warning, fought like demons, and vanished before the sun rose. German commanders, shocked by the suddenness of defeat, reported to headquarters, "These Americans are different. They own the night." Word spread quickly through the Wehrmacht. The 104th Division was not green. It was lethal. Through the winter of 1944, the Timberwolves proved it again and again. On November 2nd, they crossed the Mark River in a daring night operation that caught the enemy completely unprepared. The crossing succeeded with minimal casualties. 2 weeks later, on November 16th, they attacked fortified German positions in the Aachen sector, positions that had held against repeated daylight assaults by other Allied units. Allen's men came in darkness, and the line broke. Then came December. The Germans launched their last great offensive, the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. While chaos erupted along the front, Allen's division held. From December 15, 1944, to February 22, 1945, the 104th absorbed wave after wave of attack, never yielding ground, never allowing the line to break. They became a wall in the dark forest, unshakable and unbroken. By late February, the tide turned. On the 23rd, the Timberwolves crossed the Roer River and went on the attack, punching deep into Germany itself. The Germans began referring to them in intercepted reports as elite, night-fighting troops. Fear had become their weapon. Captured German documents revealed that entire defensive plans were being rewritten because of them. Units were forced to stay on constant high alert, spreading their men thinner and exhausting themselves in anticipation of Allen's after-dark assaults. That was precisely his intention. An enemy that couldn't rest was an enemy that couldn't fight effectively. Even Axis Sally, the infamous Nazi propagandist broadcasting from Rome, took notice. Her radio taunts were meant to demoralize Allied troops, but when she complained about unfair American night fighting, it only confirmed the Timberwolves' effectiveness. If the enemy thought your tactics were unfair, you were doing something right. On March 5, 1945, Allen's division captured Cologne, one of Germany's largest cities. 3 weeks later, on March 22nd, they crossed the Rhine, the symbolic heart of Germany, and pressed onward, advancing almost 200 miles in just 9 days. The Germans were collapsing, but the Timberwolves never slowed. Then came Nordhausen on April 11, 1945. The 104th, alongside the 3rd Armored Division, liberated the Nordhausen concentration camp. Nothing could have prepared them for what they found. 3,000 bodies lay scattered across the campgrounds, many decomposing where they had fallen. 750 prisoners were still alive, though barely, skeletal, diseased, too weak to stand. They had been slave laborers in the underground Dora Mittelbau complex, forced to build V-2 rockets for Hitler's vengeance campaign. When the Germans fled, they left the prisoners to die. For 7 months, Allen's men had faced the enemy in open battle and respected them as soldiers. But what they saw at Nordhausen stripped away that respect. This was not war, it was evil made manifest. Allen walked through the camp himself, silent, grim. Then he gave a single order: photograph everything. He wanted proof. He wanted the world to see what had been done. He brought German civilians from nearby towns to witness the horror firsthand. Some claimed ignorance. Allen didn't care. "You will see," he told them. "You will know. You will help bury the dead." The war, however, was not yet over. From April 15th to 19, the Timberwolves fought to capture the industrial city of Halle. The battle was brutal, street to street, house to house, room to room. The Germans fought with desperation, turning every building into a fortress. Artillery flattened whole blocks. Tanks blasted holes through walls. Casualties mounted on both sides. During the siege, Allen met a remarkable figure, Count Felix von Luckner, the legendary Sea Devil of World War I, once a daring naval raider, now an old man trying to save his city from destruction. Von Luckner approached Allen under a flag of truce, pleading for a negotiated surrender to spare civilian lives. On April 26, 1945, near the Elbe, Allen listened. He respected courage, even in an enemy. The two men, warriors from different eras, spoke as soldiers, not as foes. Their agreement saved much of Halle from ruin. Later, in recognition of his humanity, von Luckner was made an honorary colonel of the 104th Division. On April 26, 1945, near the Elbe River, Allen's troops made contact with advancing Soviet forces. The Third Reich was split in two. The end had come. By the time victory was declared, the 104th Infantry Division had fought for 200 straight days. They had never failed a single major objective. Not once had they been driven back. The Germans had learned to fear the night. Even Axis Sally, in her final broadcasts, still complained about the unfair Americans who attacked in darkness. Wehrmacht reports warned new units about the Timberwolves, the Americans who come when the lights go out. Canadian General Guy Simonds summed it up best. Once the Timberwolves got their teeth into the Boche, they never let go. In March 1945, Omar Bradley visited Allen's headquarters. It had been 18 months since he'd relieved him of command in Sicily. What he found astonished him. The 104th was one of the most effective divisions in Europe. Disciplined, confident, lethal, Bradley later admitted, "Terry, I am pleasantly surprised to see these young Timberwolves of yours ranked with the 1st and the 9th as the finest assault divisions in the European theater." The 1st Division, the big red one, had been Allen's old command. The 9th was another elite unit of veterans. To be named among them after less than 5 months of combat was extraordinary. Allen smiled at Bradley's words and replied with his characteristic mix of humility and grit. "Brad, the 1st and the 9th are in damned fast company." It wasn't arrogance, it was fact. The man once criticized for lacking discipline had built a division that never lost a battle. The methods that got him fired in Sicily had created one of the deadliest and most efficient fighting forces of the war. Terry Allen had proven his point beyond all doubt. Discipline could come from loyalty, courage could be taught through exhaustion, and victory could be forged in darkness. The Germans had called them night devils. Allen preferred another name, his own men's, the Timberwolves. They had mastered the night, and in doing so, they had helped end the war. When the war finally ended, the accolades poured in. But for Terry Allen, victory could not wash away the sting of what had happened in Sicily. That dismissal followed him like a shadow, a scar he carried even in triumph. Yet he had answered his critics the only way he knew how. Not with words, not with politics, but through results. He had done it again. With an entirely new division, green troops with no combat experience, he had proved beyond doubt that his earlier success was no fluke. His methods worked. His discipline, though unorthodox, forged real warriors. His leadership turned raw recruits into one of the most formidable fighting forces in Europe. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Terry Allen had commanded 2 divisions through some of the hardest campaigns of the Second World War. The 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, had carved its legend in North Africa and Sicily. The 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves, had fought through the heart of Germany itself. Both divisions, separated by time and circumstance, shared one thing in common. They believed they were the best in the United States Army. And perhaps they were right. Consider what Allen achieved. He took the big red one, already proud and storied, and made it the cutting edge of American offensives in North Africa. He led them through the disaster of Kasserine Pass and taught them how to fight and win against German armor at El Ghoutar. He landed them at Gela under withering fire and held that beachhead against repeated counterattacks. He drove them up the brutal Sicilian mountains at Troina, enduring 24 German counterattacks before finally breaking through. Every mission given to his division was completed. Every battle fought was won. Then, when others thought his career over, when the Army's bureaucrats believed they had buried him under polite dismissal, Allen started over. He took command of the 104th Infantry Division, a collection of untested factory workers and farm boys, and molded them into what General Omar Bradley himself called one of the finest assault divisions in the European theater. He trained them harder than anyone thought possible. He made them masters of night combat, of silence, of movement in darkness. He led them through 200 consecutive days of combat without a single major defeat. They crossed rivers under fire. They took fortified cities. They advanced farther and faster than seasoned divisions. They liberated camps of horror and bore witness to the cost of tyranny. And they did all of this in just 7 months. That was not luck. That was not chance. That was command. That was Terry Allen. He had done it twice, once with hardened veterans and again with raw recruits. 2 divisions, 2 theaters, 2 triumphs. That is the mark of a commander whose brilliance cannot be denied. Allen retired from the U.S. Army on August 31, 1946, with the rank of Major General. He had earned almost everything a soldier could hope for, except one thing: his 3rd star. He never became a lieutenant general. Perhaps that was the cost of being too aggressive, too bold, too unwilling to play the political game. The same traits that made him a superb battlefield commander: his bluntness, his intensity, his disregard for bureaucratic niceties, made him impossible for the peacetime army to manage. He drank, not heavily in combat, but enough to concern the button-down officers who valued decorum over daring. General George C. Marshall himself wrote to him during the war, cautioning, "There have come to me from several different sources indications that you had been drinking. I do not mean that you appeared under the influence, but that you were drinking in the daytime." The letter was a warning, but it was also a sign of respect. Marshall didn't relieve him. He didn't reprimand him publicly. He knew the difference between a problem and a fighter with rough edges. Marshall needed winners, and Terry Allen won, but not everyone saw it that way. Bradley and Eisenhower were shaping a long war, building an army of polished professionals, disciplined, obedient, and conventional. Allen didn't fit. He was brilliant, unpredictable, too much of a maverick. They had tried to quietly move him aside, but instead, he had come roaring back with the Timberwolves and embarrassed them with his success. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who understood soldiers better than most, once wrote about Terry Allen. "Major General Terry Allen was one of my favorite people, partly because he did not give a damn for hell or high water, partly because he was more colorful than most, and partly because he was the only general outside the Air Forces I could call by his first name." Pyle described him as a man who lived only to fight, who had been shot up in one war and didn't mind being shot up again in another. His philosophy of victory was brutally simple. Just wade in and murder the hell out of the low-down good-for-nothings. That was Terry Allen. Direct, profane, relentless, and utterly devoted to his men. After his retirement, Allen settled in El Paso, Texas, near Fort Bliss, where his father had once served as a cavalry officer. He had spent his entire life in uniform. Now, finally, he tried to live quietly. But peace, for Allen, was short-lived. On October 17, 1967, his only son, Lieutenant Colonel Terry de la Mesa Allen, Jr., was killed in Vietnam. He was commanding the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, the same regiment his father had led decades earlier in the same division, the Big Red one. The family legacy had come full circle. That day, near Lai Khe, Allen Jr.'s battalion walked into a massive Viet Cong ambush, 2 enemy battalions waiting in an L-shaped trap. Heavy machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades tore into the column. The lead companies were shredded in minutes. Allen Jr. moved toward the front, trying to rally his men, directing their fire, calling for reinforcements. He was hit again and again, but refused to withdraw. He died fighting, standing in the open, leading his soldiers under fire. The battle, later known as Ong Than, was one of the costliest single-day losses of the war. Between 58 and 64 Americans were killed. Lieutenant Colonel Allen was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his valor. For the old general in El Paso, it was a wound from which he would never recover. His health was already failing, but the death of his son broke something deep inside him. The tradition of service that had defined the Allen family for generations now felt like a curse. He suffered strokes, heart problems, and a collapse of the will that had carried him through decades of war. On September 12, 1969, Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen died in El Paso at the age of 81. He was buried at Fort Bliss National Cemetery beside his son. The old cavalryman, The warrior who had led men through the sands of Africa, the mountains of Sicily, and the forests of Germany was finally at rest. But the story didn't end there. At the United States Military Academy at West Point, the very place that had expelled him as a cadet in 1911 for academic failure, there is now an award in his name. The General Terry de la Mesa Allen Award, given to the cadet with the highest rating in military science. The institution that once told him he wasn't fit to be an officer now honors him as a model of military excellence. The failed cadet became one of the most successful combat commanders in American history. Those German soldiers who waited in the forests of Belgium in October 1944 had no idea what was coming. They thought they faced another green American division, easy prey. Instead, they met Terry Allen's Timberwolves. Within days, their reports told a different story. An American division that attacked at night, moved like ghosts, and struck like veterans. They wrote of a new kind of enemy, disciplined, invisible, and relentless. They learned the name of the man behind it, Terrible Terry Allen. By the war's end, those who had faced his divisions understood. It wasn't brutality that made him feared. It wasn't overwhelming firepower. It was the precision, the discipline, the transformation he instilled in ordinary men. It was his refusal to accept excuses, his demand that every soldier become the best version of himself. Allen never commanded entire armies. He never became a household name like Patton or Eisenhower, but among the men who fought under him, and the Germans who fought against him, his reputation was iron. He never lost a major battle. He never failed a mission. He took two completely different divisions and turned both into elite fighting forces. He proved that with the right training, the right leadership, and unbreakable will, American soldiers could match and beat the best the enemy had to offer. When the Germans whispered about the Timberwolves, they used one phrase again and again. They own the night. And at the head of those silent, deadly columns of men was Terry Allen, the man the Army tried to sideline, the man who refused to fade away, the man who proved that true leadership isn't granted by rank or favor. It's earned, battle by battle, night after night, in the mud, the smoke, and the fire.